He received a message from an old friend, who died 3 years ago. Detective Tom Blake sat in his car, finishing the last of his cold coffee. The rhythmic patter of rain against the roof had almost lulled him into a trance when his phone vibrated against the center console. A simple text message, but one that made his heart constrict painfully in his chest. "I need help. I'm in trouble. Nick." Tom stared at the screen for several long seconds, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. Nick Randall, his best friend and former partner, had died 3 years ago, a tragic accident that Tom had never fully accepted or recovered from. He took a deep breath and dialed the number with trembling fingers. The rings echoed in his ear, 1, 2, 3. "Hello." The voice on the other end was weak, trembling, barely above a whisper. An icy chill spread through Tom's body. "Nick?" Silence stretched between them, seeming to last an eternity. Then, a faint whisper, "Find me." The line went dead. Tom bolted from his car, immediately redialing the number. The automated voice informed him that the subscriber was unavailable. He tried again with the same result, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rain had intensified, soaking through his jacket as he stood in the police station parking lot. 20 minutes later, he was in the archives, pulling the dusty box containing Nick's case files. The official report stated that Nick had drowned during a late-night fishing trip at Lake Blackwood. Body found, identified, buried. Case closed. But the phone, the number that had sent the message, had been disconnected 3 years ago, after Nick's death. Tom had been there when Nick's wife, Sarah, had cancelled the service, tears streaming down her face as she methodically erased the digital footprints of her husband's existence. Tom spread the documents across the table, scanning through familiar pages. The coroner's report confirmed drowning as the cause of death. Water in the lungs, no signs of struggle. The toxicology report showed a moderate blood alcohol level, not enough to incapacitate, but enough to impair judgment. Everything pointed to a tragic accident. He pulled out his own phone again, staring at the message. It was still there, not a figment of his imagination. Tom ran his finger over the timestamp, 10:37 p.m., less than an hour ago. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Blake." Tom jumped, nearly knocking over his cold coffee. Detective Marissa Carter stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scattered papers. "Randall's case. I thought that was put to bed years ago," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Tom hesitated. Carter was good police, but she was also practical to a fault. Would she believe him if he told her about the message? "Just tying up some loose ends," he replied, gathering the papers back into the folder. Carter raised an eyebrow. "At midnight? On your day off?" "Couldn't sleep," Tom muttered, avoiding her gaze. She studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, don't stay too late. You look like hell already." After she left, Tom returned to the files, searching for anything he might have missed the first time around. The witness statements all matched. Nick had gone fishing alone that night, something he did often when a case was troubling him. His boat was found capsized the next morning, his body floating nearby. But something didn't add up. Nick had been an excellent swimmer, having grown up near the ocean. And he'd been careful on the water, especially after dark. Tom closed the file and made a decision. He needed to visit Lake Blackwood, the scene of Nick's death. He checked his watch, 12:47 a.m. The lake was about an hour's drive away. Perfect timing for a midnight investigation. As he drove through the deserted roads, memories of Nick flooded back. Their academy days, working their first cases together, the countless hours spent in stakeouts and interrogation rooms. Nick had been more than a partner, he'd been family. When Nick met Sarah, Tom had been his best man. When they had their daughter, Lily, Tom became her godfather. And when Nick died, Tom had been the one to identify the body, sparing Sarah that final, terrible task. The rain had stopped by the time Tom reached Lake Blackwood, but a thick fog had settled over the water, giving it an otherworldly appearance. He parked near the same dock where Nick had launched his boat that final night and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. What was he doing here? Chasing a ghost? A prank? Or something more sinister? With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. The air was heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. An eerie silence hung over the place, no chirping crickets, no croaking frogs, not even the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. It was as if the lake itself was holding its breath. Tom switched on his flashlight and walked toward the dock, its wooden planks slick with moisture. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating the black water beyond. And there, at the end of the dock, something caught his eye. An old wooden boat. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He'd recognize that boat anywhere. It was Nick's, the same one that had supposedly sunk 3 years ago. The police had found it capsized, waterlogged, with one of the oars floating nearby. Yet here it was, bobbing gently in the water, as if waiting for its owner to return. Tom approached cautiously, his police instincts kicking in. This could be a setup, a trap designed to lure him here. He scanned the tree-line, searching for any sign of movement, but the fog obscured everything beyond 20 feet. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the dense air. No response. When he reached the boat, he ran his fingers along the weathered wood. It was real, tangible, not a hallucination. The name, Second Chance, was still painted on the side, though the letters had faded considerably. Nick had named it after his and Tom's partnership, a reminder of how they'd both been given second chances in life after difficult beginnings. Tom's flashlight beam swept across the boat's interior. A rusty tackle box. An empty thermos. A frayed rope. And something else, something that hadn't been there before. A cell phone. Tom's pulse quickened as he carefully picked it up. The black casing was slick with moisture, but when he pressed the power button, the screen lit up immediately, revealing a familiar lock screen photo, Nick, Sarah, and little Lily at the beach, laughing into the camera. Nick's phone. The same one that should have been at the bottom of this lake for 3 years. As if on cue, the phone vibrated in his hand. A new message appeared on the screen. "You're close. Look into the water." Tom's mouth went dry. With trembling hands, he directed his flashlight toward the lake's surface. The beam reflected off the still water, creating an almost mirror-like effect. In it, Tom could see himself, pale and tense, standing alone on the dock. But he wasn't alone in the reflection. Next to him stood a figure, Nick, soaking wet, his skin pallid and his eyes hollow, staring directly at Tom. Tom spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just empty air and swirling fog. The phone vibrated again. It wasn't an accident. Find who did this. Tom staggered back, nearly losing his footing on the slippery dock. Who had killed Nick, if his death had been ruled accidental? And why was this happening now, 3 years later? He steadied himself against a post, forcing his breathing to slow. Think, Blake, think. If this wasn't a hallucination or a cruel prank, then someone was trying to tell him something about Nick's death that had been overlooked. Tom tucked the phone into his pocket and began a more thorough examination of the boat. The wooden seats were worn but intact. The oars were crossed at the bottom, both present, contradicting the official report that stated one had been found floating separately. The tackle box contained standard fishing equipment, nothing unusual. But when Tom lifted the middle seat, he found something that made his blood run cold. A small plastic bag, sealed and tucked into a crevice. Inside was a water-damaged photograph of Nick standing with a man Tom didn't recognize, a tall, thin man with a distinctive scar across his right cheek. On the back, written in Nick's handwriting, were the words, "Insurance policy." If anything happens to me, this is why. Tom's mind raced. Had Nick been investigating something before his death? Something dangerous enough that he felt the need for an insurance policy? Just as he was about to examine the photo more closely, the beam of another flashlight cut through the fog from the shore. Police. Identify yourself, a familiar voice called out. Tom raised his hands instinctively. Detective Tom Blake, Central Division, he called back, squinting against the light. The figure approached and Tom recognized Detective Carter, her service weapon drawn but pointed downward. Blake. What the hell are you doing out here in the middle of the night? She asked, holstering her gun. I could ask you the same thing, Tom replied, carefully slipping the plastic bag into his jacket pocket. Carter gave him a long, appraising look. After I saw you in the archives, I checked the log. You accessed Nick Randall's file 3 times in the past week. Then you disappeared in the middle of the night to the place where he died. She paused. I was worried about you, so I followed you. Tom considered his options. Carter had been transferred to their precinct a year after Nick's death. She hadn't known him, hadn't been part of the investigation. Could he trust her with this? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said finally. Try me. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Tom took a deep breath. I received a text message tonight from Nick's phone. A phone that's been disconnected for 3 years. Then I found his boat, which supposedly sank, right here at the dock. And this. He pulled out the phone, showing her the screen with the messages. Carter's expression remained neutral, but Tom could see the skepticism in her eyes. This is Nick's phone. You're sure? She asked, taking it from him carefully. Positive. I'd recognize it anywhere. Same case, same lock screen photo. She examined it for a moment. And you think this means his death wasn't an accident? I don't know what to think, Tom admitted. But I need to find out. Carter handed the phone back to him. Look, Blake, I understand grief. It can make us see things that aren't there, make connections that don't exist. You think I'm imagining this? Tom gestured to the boat. That's Nick's boat, Carter. The same one that supposedly sank when he drowned. Carter sighed, then shined her flashlight over the vessel. Let's say for argument's sake that this is Randall's boat. That doesn't mean there's anything supernatural going on. Someone could have salvaged it, fixed it up. And the phone? Tom challenged. The messages? Technology can be manipulated, Blake. You know that better than most. She crossed her arms. Who would want to mess with you like this? Anyone holding a grudge? Tom ran a hand through his damp hair. The list of people who might want to get back at him was substantial, occupational hazard for a detective with 15 years on the force. But this felt personal in a different way. I need to talk to Sarah, he said suddenly. Nick's widow. At 1 a.m. Carter raised an eyebrow. She deserves to know. Tom was already moving back toward the shore. And she might have insight we don't. Carter fell into step beside him. I'm coming with you. Tom started to protest, but she cut him off. Either I come along, or I report you for tampering with evidence in a closed case. Your choice. The drive to Sarah Randall's house was tense, with Carter occasionally glancing at Tom as if he might snap at any moment. They pulled up to a modest 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood around 2:30 a.m. A single light burned in an upstairs window. She still keeps night hours, Tom murmured. Nick always said she was a night owl. They approached the front door, and Tom hesitated before knocking softly. A minute passed, then another. Just as he was about to knock again, the door opened a crack, secured by a chain. Sarah Randall's tired eyes widened at the sight of him. Tom. What are you doing here at this hour? I'm sorry to disturb you, Sarah. This is Detective Carter. We need to talk to you about Nick. A flicker of something, fear, anger, crossed Sarah's face. She closed the door, unlatched the chain, and let them in. Sarah had aged in the 3 years since Nick's death. Her once vibrant auburn hair was streaked with gray, and deep lines had formed around her eyes and mouth. She led them into a living room filled with family photos, many featuring Nick. "Is Lily asleep?" Tom asked, referring to their daughter who would now be 8. Sarah nodded. "What's this about, Tom? Why are you bringing up Nick in the middle of the night?" Tom exchanged a glance with Carter, then pulled out his phone. "I received this message earlier tonight." He showed her the text from Nick's number. Sarah's face drained of color. She sank into the nearest chair, her hand at her throat. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I cancelled his service myself." "I know," Tom said gently. "Then I got a call from the same number. And I found this at Lake Blackwood." He pulled out Nick's phone, placing it on the coffee table between them. Sarah stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. That's Nick's phone. It went down with him." "How did you?" "It was in his boat," Tom said. "His boat that was supposed to have sunk 3 years ago but is now sitting perfectly intact at the dock where he launched it that night." Sarah's eyes darted to Carter, who remained impassive. "Is this some kind of joke, Tom? Because it's not funny." "I wish it were." He hesitated, then decided to show her the photograph as well. "I also found this. Do you recognize the man standing with Nick?" Sarah took the plastic bag with trembling hands. As she studied the photo, her expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to unmistakable fear. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. "It was hidden in Nick's boat. Do you know who he is?" Sarah's eyes flickered to Carter again, then back to Tom. "His name is Victor Mercer. He and Nick knew each other before we met." "And who is Victor Mercer?" Carter asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. Sarah swallowed hard. Nick never talked about him much. Just that they had history, and not the good kind. "I only met him once, about a month before Nick died." She paused, seeming to struggle with a decision. "Nick was acting strange during that time. Secretive. I thought maybe he was working undercover or something. Then one night, he told me if anything ever happened to him, I should look in the safe deposit box." Tom leaned forward. "What safe deposit box?" "We had one at First National. After he died, I checked it, but it was empty." Sarah's voice broke. "I always assumed he'd removed whatever was in there, but now I wonder." "You think someone else got to it first?" Carter asked. Sarah shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. The bank said only Nick had accessed it in the weeks before his death." Tom's mind was racing. The writing on the back of the photo says, "Insurance policy. If anything happens to me, this is why." Was Nick afraid of Victor Mercer? "I think so," Sarah whispered. "The night Nick told me about the safe deposit box, I overheard him on the phone. He said, 'I know what you did, and I have proof. It's over, Vic.' The next day, he went fishing and never came home." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Nick had evidence against this Victor Mercer, if he had threatened to expose him for something, it could provide motive for murder. "I need to find Victor Mercer," Tom said decisively. Carter looked skeptical. "Based on a mysterious text message and a water-damaged photo? That's not much to go on." "It's more than we had 3 years ago," Tom countered. He turned to Sarah. "Do you have any idea where I might find him?" Sarah shook her head. "I only met him that one time. Nick never mentioned where he worked or lived." A soft creak from the hallway made them all turn. Lily stood there in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mom. Uncle Tom. Her small voice was thick with confusion. Sarah quickly tucked the photograph away. "It's okay, sweetheart. Uncle Tom just stopped by to say hello." Lily padded into the room and climbed onto Tom's lap, a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache. "You never visit anymore," she accused him softly. "I know, Munchkin. I'm sorry." Tom smoothed her tangled hair. "I've just been very busy with work. Catching bad guys like Daddy used to." Her innocent question hung in the air. "Something like that," he managed. After Sarah took Lily back to bed, she returned with a determined expression. "There might be one person who knows more about Victor Mercer. Nick's old partner before you, Frank Downey. They worked together during Nick's first years on the force. If this Mercer was part of Nick's past, Frank might know something." Tom nodded. "Downey retired to Florida years ago." "He actually moved back about 6 months ago," Sarah corrected him. "Some health issues. He wanted to be closer to his daughter. He called me when he got back, wanted to check in on Lily and me. Do you have his contact information?" Sarah wrote down an address on the outskirts of town. "He's been living there since he returned." "Tom," she hesitated. "If you find out that Nick didn't just drown." "I'll find the truth," Tom promised, squeezing her hand. "Whatever it is." Dawn was breaking as Tom and Carter left Sarah's house. The eastern sky had turned a pale pink, burning away the last of the night's fog. "I should report this," Carter said as they reached their cars. "Interfering with evidence in a closed case." "Then why haven't you?" Tom challenged. Carter considered him for a long moment. "Because I've reviewed Randall's case file. The investigation was rushed, conclusions drawn too quickly. And because I've never seen you like this, Blake. You're one of the most level-headed detectives I know. If you think something's not right here, maybe it's worth looking into." Tom nodded, grateful for her tacit permission. "I'm going to see Frank Downey." "I'll run a background check on this Victor Mercer," Carter offered. "See what pops up." "But Blake," her expression turned serious. "Be careful. If someone did kill your friend and covered it up all this time, they won't take kindly to you digging around now." Frank Downey lived in a small bungalow surrounded by overgrown grass and untended flower beds. The retired detective had aged considerably since Tom had last seen him at Nick's funeral. His once robust frame had shrunk, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. "Blake," he greeted Tom at the door, surprise evident in his rheumy eyes. "Been a while." "Too long, Frank." Tom followed him inside to a cluttered living room dominated by a large recliner facing a television. "So what brings you to my humble abode at 7 in the morning?" Frank asked, lowering himself into the recliner with a wince. Tom decided on directness. "Victor Mercer." The name had an immediate effect. Frank's weathered face tightened, and his eyes grew wary. "Where'd you hear that name?" "I found a photo of him with Nick. I think he might be connected to Nick's death." Frank was silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "I always knew this might come back around someday. Just hoped it would be after I was gone." He gestured to a cabinet in the corner. "Top shelf, behind the whiskey. There's a file." Tom retrieved a thin manila folder. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, all involving a series of armored car robberies from 15 years ago. "Nick and I were working robbery back then," Frank explained. "These heists were professional jobs, in and out in under 3 minutes, no witnesses, no evidence left behind. 4 men dead across 3 robberies." Tom scanned the articles. "Says here the case went cold." "Officially, yes." Frank's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "But Nick and I, we figured it out. The crew was led by a guy named Victor Mercer, ex-military, had the skills and connections to pull it off. We were building a case, gathering evidence, doing everything by the book. But? Tom prompted, sensing the turn in the story. But our lieutenant at the time, James Sullivan, suddenly shut us down. Ordered us to drop the investigation, said it was being taken over by a federal task force. Frank's face twisted with old anger. No such task force ever materialized. The case just disappeared. Tom felt a chill settle over him. You think Sullivan was involved? I think $5 million went missing from those robberies, and Sullivan retired to a beachfront property in Costa Rica 6 months later. Frank shrugged. Nick couldn't let it go. He kept digging, unofficially. I told him to drop it, we both had families, careers to think about. Eventually, he said he had, but I never fully believed him. And now Nick is dead, Tom said quietly. And now Nick is dead, Frank echoed. When I heard it was a drowning, I had my suspicions. Nick was too good a swimmer. But what could I say? I had no proof, just an old cop's paranoia. Tom pulled out his phone. I received this text message last night, Frank. From Nick's number. Frank squinted at the screen, then looked up at Tom with wide eyes. That's not possible. There's more. I found Nick's boat at Lake Blackwood, intact, not sunken. And his phone, with more messages. Tom showed him the second text, it wasn't an accident. Find who did this. Frank crossed himself, a gesture Tom had never seen the old detective make before. You think Nick's ghost is trying to solve his own murder? I don't know what to think anymore, Tom admitted. But I know I need to find Victor Mercer. Frank shifted uncomfortably. Last I heard, he was living under the name Victor Mason, running some kind of import-export business downtown. That was years ago, though. Tom's phone buzzed with a text from Carter, found your man. Victor Mercer, aka Victor Mason. CEO of Mason Imports. Office in the Riverside District. Meeting him now. Tom felt a surge of alarm. Carter's going to see Mercer. Alone. That's not good, Frank said grimly. If Mercer killed Nick to keep him quiet. Tom was already heading for the door. Thanks, Frank. I'll be in touch. As he raced toward the Riverside District, Tom's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Nick's number, she's in danger. Hurry.